Hello friends and my lovely viewers. Welcome back to the channel of Neon Safe. Today we will rank the remaining sprites, from the awakened Bulko, and all the way to the awakened Wraithen. Let's get started.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. I'm tired of shit.
Bulko's Sprite skill increases the back row ally champion's damage by 10% and prevents them from using their ultimate skills for 10 seconds. The debuff can be dispelled. And at 3-star ascension, this buff increases to 13%. Allowing all the back row teammates to be buffed with 10% more damage is a truly amazing buff in my opinion. Just by looking at this skill of his, I honestly think we may place him in the very top S tier for both PvP and PvE. Oh, by the way, just to mention it, this sprite cannot be obtained in the Conjuring Sprite summoning. If I remember correctly, he can only be found in the rapid top-up packs, and he may also be hidden behind a paywall for all I know. So that kinda sucks to be honest. But still, if we are able to acquire Bulko, we should definitely consider having him on the attunement platform. Moving on, the next sprite in line is the awakened Draggie. His sprite skill affects the healer of the opponent's team. So basically when an enemy champion receives healing effects from one of their allies, that enemy healer will have his or hers damage dealt reduced by 2.5% for 2 seconds. This can stack up to 8 layers. And at 3-star, the percentage increases to 3.1%. I honestly do not think this sprite skill looks super useful. It is still great to have, but it only impacts the opponent team if they have a healer. And that is not always the case as we may know, especially not in a PvP battle. So it is much better to have a sprite whose sprite skill works against all team comps and multiple enemies. As for its ranking, I'd say this sprite is a solid B tier in PvP, and unfortunately he is a F tier in PvE. There are no chances of having a healer for the boss in PvE, so this F tier is kinda self-explanatory. The next epic sprite we have is the awakened Copuff. The sprite skill of his decreases 2 random back row enemy champion strength resistance by 3% in combat. At 3-star, this percentage increases to 5%. It is always great to make the enemies weaker to strength-based attacks, and I believe this skill may be very useful to our team in PvP. But I cannot say the same thing for PvE battles, since this is a sprite skill meant to aim for 2 enemies instead of 1. It would kinda be wasted in a PvE type of battle is what I mean. So, as for the ranking of this Copuff sprite, in PvP I'd personally say we may place him in the A tier, while for PvE, I'd unfortunately have to place him in the F tier. That being said, let us see the next sprite. This is the awakened Earl. His sprite skill buffs a random allied front row champion's fortitude by 4% for the first 18 seconds of battle. And every 6 seconds, aka a total of 3 times, all of the control effects will be removed from the champion. If we ascend this sprite to 3-star, then the fortitude buff will increase to 7% instead. This sprite skill looks decent in my opinion. It is not giving me an overly powerful kind of vibe, but it is not a complete miss either. The sprite may not be as useful in PvE compared to the PvP battles though, but his skill still works alright in both types of battles. So, we may put this sprite in a solid B tier for PvP, and as for PvE, I believe he belongs to the C tier. The next sprite we have is the awakened Lucky. His skill causes all the enemies of the opponent team to take 6% more damage from normal attacks and skills. When the enemy champions are sealed, they will take an additional 12% damage from normal attacks and skills. Seal basically prevents the use of ultimate skills. We have one tiny problem with this skill, where the enemies under control effects like stun or silence will not take increased damage. But even so, this sprite skill looks perfect. The debuff applies to all enemies in battle, and it involves all kinds of attacks, aka both skills and normal attacks. If we also ascend the sprite, then the buff's percentages increase to 9% and 18%. I seriously think this sprite is a top tier in both PvP and PvE. There is nothing stopping it from throwing the enemies into a disadvantageous battle. About the ranking, I personally believe this sprite to belong in the S tier in both PvP and PvE. So we should definitely try our very best to acquire this lucky little pet. The next sprite in line is the awakened Tom. His Sprite skill gives a random front row allied champion a 20% increase in fortitude. That same ally will also deal damage each second within a small radius, equal to 0.8% of the champion's max constitution, up to 2000% of the champion's strength. This damage does not restore energy to enemies, and the entire Sprite skill effect we just mentioned only works for the first 30 seconds of the battle. By ascending this Sprite to 3-star, we only increase the damage percentage from 0.8% to 1%, so that isn't very impressive in my opinion. And I honestly don't think this Sprite skill is very useful to us, as it mainly focuses on boosting the fortitude of a random ally. I believe he may be more suitable for PvE instead of PvP, since it is more worth it having a durable team in PvE. So, I'd say we may place this Sprite in the C tier for PvP, and B tier for PvE. If we have other options of sprites that are B tiers in PvP, I absolutely recommend investing our resources into those sprites instead of this one. Now, we only got a couple sprites left, so let's move on. The Awakened pick is the next sprite in line. After 5 seconds pass by in battle, the Sprite skill will activate and deal true damage equal to 5% of the 2 most rear enemies' constitution every 9 seconds. The 2 enemies also get stunned for 1 second every time this attack is launched at them. At 3-star, the percentage of 5% increases to 6% and the duration of his stun effect increases from 1 second to 1.5 seconds. I can already see this working really well in PvE type of battles, aka boss fights. Because the damage dealt is based on the amount of enemy constitution, the damage buff may become pretty high, since the bosses of Bloodline have a massive amount of constitution. But for team fights where the enemies do not have lots of constitution, this buff won't be very beneficial in my opinion. So it depends on who the enemy is, and thus I don't think this sprite will be a high tier in PvP battles. I'd say we may place our pick sprite in the C tier for PvP, and A tier for PvE. The last sprite we have is the Awakened Wraithen. His sprite skill will trigger for the first time when 4 seconds have passed in battle. All the front row champions will gain a permanent shield equal to 4.5% of their max constitution every 2 seconds. This can stack up to a total of 6 layers. When the limit of 6 layers has been reached, the shield gain will pause. And when the shield breaks, it will automatically restore itself if the layer limit has not been reached. This may be a really good sprite skill to have in PvP battles. The front row tends to be more vulnerable to attacks, so with this shield buff, our front row champions may last for longer in battle. Our sprite is more into defending the team with buffs, rather than boosting our teammates with damage-dealing buffs. As for the ranking of this sprite, I'd say we may place it in the A tier for PvP, and C tier for PvE. Now that we have ranked all of the sprites, which sprites should we select for the attunement platform? If I was to give my own personal opinion on this, I'd say the couple of top S tier ranked sprites may be our best pick. So that would mean Bulko and the Awakened sprite called Lucky. They may be a great combo as Bulko focuses on buffing the damage dealt to the enemies, while Lucky focuses on weakening the enemies, which leads to the enemies overall taking more damage. As for the third slot, it is more flexible. We may put for instance Wraithen or the Awakened Hipperin into this slot. But in the end, this is entirely up to each and one of us, as it may also depend a little bit on the individual team comp of ours. This all being said, do keep in mind the rankings I've placed our sprites into are just my own research, personal opinion and observation. So if you have a different experience with the sprites, and think the ranking or selection of sprites may not apply to you or your team comp, that is completely alright. You may choose the sprites you prefer, and there is no obligation to follow this ranking or opinions of mine if you don't want to follow it. By the way, just a small heads up, all of the sprites from Draggie to Wraithen are not obtainable in the summoning circle. From the information I have found, these sprites can at the moment only be obtained from Gleam Exchange or Epic Sprite chests. So that kinda sucks to be honest. Anyways, which of these sprites would you like to have in your team? Feel free to let us know in the comments section below. You may also ask questions or share your own opinion on the sprites ranking, if you feel like it. I think we have covered most of the topic for today, so it is time for us to end the video now. Thank you so much for watching today's content. Have a lovely week, and we will see you in the next one. Take care, stay foxy, adios, bye.